formally begin, this is the last of the 6-part series. I have some words of appreciation that I want to extend for all of you who have been coming in and out, and for a core of you that I recognize you have been faithful throughout the series. And I hope that you are organically seeing the dots sort of connect themselves in terms of racial capitalism and its impact on land, ownership, housing, around policing, our carceral state system, around debt and financialized aspects of capitalism, about our relationship with the community outreach teams who are doing their work in partnership with organizations who are maybe more immediately thoughtful and impacted, but that we are thinking about all of these relationships as the overarching scaffolding of racial capitalism connects the dots. Okay, I think I've spoken enough so that we've tested out the sound. There are 2 ways that I'm aware of where those of us who are interested in furthering the conversation, or even simply the opportunity to convene and to revisit, because you all are stepping into complexities upon complexities. The scaffolding is immense, and it weaves in and out in intricate and meticulous ways. So there are further opportunities for you to gather for deepening conversation. And I'm going to ask Maura and then Angela to speak a little bit about these opportunities.
Thank you. So I'm Maura Williams. I'm from the Racial Justice Team, and I would like to invite you all to a circle conversation on Saturday morning, not this Saturday because we're all busy, but on the 4th from 9 to 11 in the morning. So if you have enjoyed both the content and the form of what the last series has presented and the shared insights, we're going to continue that conversation and perhaps do some imagining about what we as a Unity community, how we might follow up to some of the insights that we've shared. So I hope you can join us. Yes, I was supposed to say that. That's what this is for. Right?
And I'm Angela Wilcox. One of the groups that I'm connected to here is the Justice Learning Partners. It used to be the something else. Yeah. Anti-Racism Literacy Partners. The idea is that you join our group. It's all virtual, so it's more accessible than having to show up here in the building. We introduce a series of sources. You decide which source you're interested in diving deep into, and you'll be partnered with 1 to 5 or 6 other people, and you are accountability partners with each other. You set up your own virtual or in-person meeting times over a 2-month span, and then you come back and report out not only what did you get out of the source, but what action are you ready to take because of what you learned. This has been going on since the summer of 2020. We have some longtime members of the ALP here in the room. One of the sources that we'll be offering start on the April 15th meeting. Again, it's a Zoom link. You register, you'll get emailed the Zoom link. You join from home with your cat in your lap. And then you work out with your partners according to your own schedule how you want to dive into this resource and be accountability partners with each other. And one of those resources is Decolonizing Wealth, which some people here have read before, but we're going to start offering a series of resources connected to these conversations over the next year. So we hope you will join us for that as well. Oh, and I'll just go now. All right, so we will open with a poem by Aisha Siddiqa. On another panel about climate, they asked me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem. What if the future is soft And revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight. Whole cities breathe, and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promised to no one as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher yet. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful it is that we exist. What if we stun existence one more time? When I wake up, get out of bed, my 7-year-old cousin with her ruptured belly tags along. Then follows my grandmother, aunts, my other cousins, and the violent shape of their drinking water. The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of the earth, and we are nobodies, been born from so many apocalypses. What's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. But for what it's worth, I'd do this again, gamble on humanity 100 times over. Commit to life unto life as the trees fall and take us with them. I'd follow love into extinction.
Some of you know that when in 2025, COP30 gathered to look at the science, is it 1.5 degrees? Where are we and where can we stretch it? There was a consensus that was beyond just the technical aspects, beyond just the scientific aspects. There was a consensus emerging, and the consensus began to document and articulate that viewpoint. And it can be summarized in one word: degrowth. That there was an ideology, there was in fact a religiosity or a spirituality that was all about growth upon growth upon growth, unlimited growth, infinite growth, Tower of Babel to the heavens. And this group summarized that consensus in degrowth. And some of you know that the body that articulated this letter, this consensus, was the Council of Catholic Bishops. Not Extinction Rebellion, not socialist radical activist groups, but the Catholic Church of Africa and Asia and South America and the Caribbeans about degrowth. I'm thinking about that because I'm appreciating the many of you who have been participating in this conversation. The members of the BCST and the staff, we have been really appreciative and impressed. Some of us thought that capitalism, oh my, how do we begin to unpack capitalism? And what does racial capitalism add to the complex thing that capitalism already is? And so in this 6-part series, sort of to begin to spell it out, and really to spell it out around table conversations, this Freirerian method that we have experiences and stories, and by listening and speaking, we can actually continue this learning dialogue that we have started. Tonight, the dot moves into what has been coined by Andreas Malm. He's a Swedish human ecologist. In 2016, he published a groundbreaking work. And as I read it, I didn't realize how groundbreaking it was. It was fascinating reading. But the title of his work, Shelley Butler just ordered it for our library, is Fossil Capital. He coined that, fossil capital or fossil capitalism. That in connecting the dots, one of the dots that we have to connect is our relationship with this planet, with the earth. We've already talked about land, right? Ownership of land, housing built on land. We know just by listening to the headlines, whether it's Gaza or Iran, we know the politics, the geopolitics of land and raw materials and resources and coal and oil and gas and renewables, that these two participate in the connecting of the dots as this through line that we have named here, racial capitalism, connects the dots. So tonight the focus is explicitly on fossil capital, but in the background, throughout the 6-part series, and I hope that we can wrap up tonight, not ever fully wrapping up, but at least pausing to solicit your reflections, especially those of you who have been part of the entire series, of what's emerging sort of in this synthesized whole. My undergraduate work is in philosophy of thought, and so those of you who have heard me talk about European Enlightenment thinking, its genius, its power is in fragmenting. There's something really helpful when you can take a complicated muddle and begin to separate things into fragments and look at things more distinctly. There's incredible clarity that can come out of that. But when that, like anything else, I guess, taken too far, we get fragmentation in the sense of disassociation. We get competition among the knowledges. And we lose the way in which reality and the cosmos, in its interconnectedness, and even more ethically, interdependence, we lose some of that in the way that our perspectives are fragmented, polarized, and then competing with one another. So I hope tonight reveals some particular aspects that are important for us to think about fossil capital, but always also to think about how to synthesize and integrate this into this larger scaffolding of racial capitalism. One more word before I go over here. I've said this, but I keep on getting questions, so let me say it one more time, and I'll say it as often as is necessary. There's a kind of anti-racist work that is largely referred to as identitarian anti-racist work. It is the kind of the DEI work, and it's absolutely important, necessary, and Unity has done a B+ job, a good enough job, I would say. I don't give out A's. You have done really good work. Thank you for your dedication and your ongoing work with that. But what the identitarian work does not cover, as I've been saying, is another tradition over here that is hands down not as publicly circulated. Why? Because it's really difficult. Because over here, the Black radical tradition, the Jamaicans, the Caribbean tradition, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, these people have been talking, thinking, discoursing around tables like ours about systems, about structures. And for a variety of reasons, least of all, I mean, I can think about a hyper individualistic, right? Systems and hyper individualism and focus, they don't go well together. And yet, we can all acknowledge that systems and structures like cultures, it's the water that we swim in, it's the air that we breathe, it's formational. And so this tradition nods to the identitarian anti-racist work, but they are saying it is inadequate to just do within among. It's this beyond, that we can only access by the people who have done historical analysis, by the people who have stepped back and taken a look at these connecting of dots through many methods and many rubrics and lenses and perceptions. This six-part series, in some sense, is wanting to step into this work and see how these two strands actually are complementary. They require each other. Karl Marx, whatever you may have, personal feelings about Karl Marx, was an absolute genius, was a required person when I was a student in college to read. Some of you may know this formula. Forgive me for being a little bit simple tonight, but what Karl Marx did was illuminate capitalism. And as other scholars like Gilmore, I have repeated that in her words, capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines that inequality, enshrines it. And so Cedric Robinson famously comes along out of this tradition over here and writes a book about Black Marxism, about how Marx sort of began to, but for a variety of reasons, didn't really flesh out in detail racial capitalism. How capitalism has always tried to figure out, whether it's through race, but race isn't the only way, through gender, but it has always tried to figure out ways that we can fragment people, divide them up and sort and categorize and stack them up in a hierarchy. That's what racial capitalism is getting at. Not the color of our skin. Whiteness exceeds the color of our skin, right? It is a structure. It is a system. It is a history. Karl Marx is trying to illuminate, and so it's there in volume 1, but it's more fleshed out in volume 2 of his sort of seminal work, Das Kapital. And he begins here. And he said, this is the circuitry of the worker. The worker is not interested really in accumulation. The worker is really interested in survival at a minimum, and really consumption, and not consumption in a negative way. We just consume in order to have what we need to live. We consume space, housing, clothing, transportation. So we begin with a commodity, and in capitalism, the most important commodity is the labor power, right? Think always about labor, labor, labor. We begin with a commodity, and in this circuit, there's a universal equivalent called money. It is fungible. The commodity is exchanged, it enters into circulation, and money facilitates that circulation. And we then buy whatever, clothing, transportation, food, toys for our children. We buy another commodity. These two commodities may not be the same, but they are similar in value, right? And so like a barter, but in between you have this universal equivalency called money that is operating. This is the circuitry of the worker. This is about use value. The worker is not, again, interested in the accumulation. It's about using food, using clothing. Marx then says, what about the capitalists? It is an inverse relationship. For the capitalists, you begin with this sort of venture capital, if you will. You begin with money that has been accumulated. It begins and it must end with money, because in this system, the capitalist is interested in surplus value, is interested in accumulation, is interested not in use value of some commodity, but the profit that is generated from the exchange value. So the commodity in the middle, right? And again, labor power is a really critical commodity, right? That is sold by the worker for this thing called wage, right? But from a capitalist point of view, money to commodity and back to money prime Because it's not the same money. If it's the same money, why did the capitalists go through all that trouble? It has to be a differential, a delta, a change in the value of money, money prime. These two are very simple, elementary ways in which Marx begins to illuminate capitalism. In volume 2, he gets a little bit more specific. The ellipsis, the dots, are the symbols that he used to illuminate what is sort of the magical, invisible thing, because this is about production. This is about circulation, right? There's nothing new in circulation. You can create a robot, but the robot cannot generate surplus value. The robot can only distribute, transfer the value that has been programmed into the robot, right? The only source that can generate that creative life force of a value that gives surplus is labor power. That's what's really important in Marx's understanding of capitalism. So Marx begins to put that and make it more visible. So it's the P, it's the production, it's the site, but ... It's hidden away. So you begin in capitalism with money. It circuits into a commodity, and then in the black box, in the factory, something mysterious happens alchemically. And the production is the production of a higher value commodity that then sold, is exchanged for a higher value in money. So Marx is thinking about this, and then he says, let's get a little bit clearer. He says, let's focus on this commodity. This commodity, as I said, for Marxism, labor power, LP, is where the surplus, the human value is generated that has never been there before, right? The labor power that is owned by the worker. I put owned because you and I can have fascinating conversations about whether they really own that or not. But in Marxist thinking, labor power is owned by the worker. The MP means of production, the raw materials, the land, the river, the coal, the factory, the machinery, the computers, the means of production, who owns that? The capitalists. And Marx is fascinated just right there. And I'm not going to go much farther than right here. Marx is fascinated by that because he says, this is an analogy that Andreas Malm uses. He says, imagine a woodpecker. What is the tool of a woodpecker? The means of production? The bill. And it's wonderfully suited to the woodpecker, right? And it fits in with the ecology. It's part of the metabolism, if you will, of how all of the organisms, and not just the animals, but the flora and the fauna, including the atmosphere, right, carbon emissions, it fits in. And while beavers and woodpeckers alter their environment, the way that everything belongs is such that there is a kind of balance, a belonging that works. But imagine if someone comes along and actually severs the bill from the woodpecker, severs the labor power, woodpecker, from the means of production, the bill. And this collection of bills, woodpecker bills, resides over there. It sounds absurd to us, obviously, and yet this is what Karl Marx is doing. He's not saying that you and I will have our noses or parts of our body amputated and put over there, but he's saying, think about the conditions that make for life. The human animal has a condition in which the tools and the means of production must not be severed and taken over there. Whoever severs it and takes it over there has enormous power over the woodpeckers then. The woodpeckers are sort of at a loss. The woodpeckers look to each other, should we pull our money so that we can pay the rent, so that we can borrow our bills to do the work that we must do to basically survive? Karl Marx is saying this commodity, especially labor power, and this other commodity, the factory, the tools, the land, the raw materials, the means of production, there is a rift or there is a rupture. There is an incongruity that's going on there. And it's premised on ownership. Workers own one thing, capitalists own the other. Originally, this is where we can become anthropological or religious and spiritual. Indigenous worldview. Who owns what? Don't we own each other? Or doesn't the land, doesn't the environment, the cosmos, actually, if there's an owner, they own all of us, right? But what Karl Marx is looking at is this system in which we begin with the money, then the commodity, these two things in particular, right, leads to some sort of a change, a transformation that leads to a higher quality, a higher value of commodity, and ultimately surplus value. This is the artifact and this is the story that Andreas Malm, as I mentioned, in 2016, he's fascinated by this. This is a story that I'm going to abbreviate and tell you. It's happening in Lancashire, England, in between the years about 1825 and 1850. For those of you who know Lancashire, it's the northern western part of England. Lots of waterways and rivers. Water is free. Lancashire is also the heart of the cotton industry of the world. They're putting out textiles, they're doing stuff with cotton that's amazing. And the engineered tool for this, water. Steam is beginning to rise, and there are some hybrid models of both water wheels and steam. But hands down, between water and steam, water is cheaper. Water is actually more powerful. Water is actually more efficient. And water is abundantly available. So too is the means of production around water to meet the rising demand of the cotton industry worldwide. So you and I might think, okay, water, that's the way to go. Maybe steam will evolve and develop into something more powerful, but right then and there, in that moment in time, in Lancashire, England, water. Mom goes and does meticulous research, and he scratches his head, like many people. Because around 1840, there is a mass relocation out of Lancashire. The machines, the water mills, all of that in Lancashire is abandoned as people and factories and capitalists take their cotton work to Manchester, where the water, the hydraulic power, is far inferior, where the cost of, as I said, steam is rising, is way more costly, and it doesn't actually produce the power to do the work well. So, head scratcher, why? Why are factories moving toward Manchester, where the urban centers are crowded, it's smoky, it's not the ideal condition? And as Moms does his research, he's noticing something. Back in Lancashire, the laborers, they were far fewer than in Manchester. They actually used the fact that there were fewer to have power in their negotiation with the factory capitalists. Not only that, but water, seasonality. Hey, boss, I gotta enjoy this time off, right? There's a natural organic cycle to water. There's something very site-specific with water, right? Whereas coal that powers water into steam is sort of anywhere you can place it. In Lancashire, the people, the workers, also had intimate, adjacent connection to community. Their homes were there. The people they knew in the towns were there. And if they got fired, they said, okay. And they had a safety net that could take care of them. So Moms is like thinking about this. Why would capitalists abandon all this infrastructure centered around water that was more efficient, less costly? Why are they moving to Manchester? And he says this, because in Manchester, there is disposable population of workers who are desperate for employment. There is the police. There are prisons. There are poorhouses. There is something about steam, right? As you and I can imagine, the industrialization and steam becoming more powerful. But at that time, some of you know your history, the Chartist movement was the largest worker movement going on, protesting what was happening because of capitalism's rise. So as Moms is reading the situation, he's saying, you know, the switching over to coal, steam, fossil fuels is not about the technology. It is all about control over the thing that capitalism doesn't have control over: labor power. As Mom does his research, this is what he says about where our contemporary fossil capitalist system originates. This production site is hugely shaped by the introduction of coal, steam, fossil fuel. Not because coal and steam is proving to be more efficient, more powerful, but because you can control labor 24/7 in the factory in Manchester, in an urban environment. You can have a 24/7 factory run on steam from coal. Not only does fossil fuel affect production, but the means of production obviously now move more and more toward coal and fossil fuels, because it serves, again, the interest of controlling people, workers, laborers. And in fact, Mom eventually says, let's just bracket the whole thing. The whole entire circuit is now embedded with fossil fuels. So today, when we're trying to shift over to renewables, solar, wind, let's say, to simply argue that, oh, they're more cost efficient. In fact, you and I know about green capitalism, right? We can make money off of this. Mom in 2016 is sort of shaking his head and said, I'm not so sure about that. Because even if labor is not being exploited in the same way today as it was back then, even though steam and lots of other fossil fuels are more powerful, the inherited fossil capitalist system that we have, with factories, with transportation systems where workers are gathering, with pipelines everywhere, that whole system, that infrastructure, is run by the capitalists out of this origin story. It is a class weaponization of coal and fossil fuel. It is not about people being ignorant or apathetic to science. It is about fossil fuel capitalists invested in an infrastructure that they have benefited from generations. So how do we then begin to shift over to renewables, to alternatives? And for Andreas Malm, there is really no getting around the fact that we need to look at people and labor relations. That decarbonization isn't about coming up with some sort of fascinating technology that will solve this, because the political economic consequences of that to the capitalists who hear about that, right, will be profound upset, because the system from which they benefit, right, has to keep control over the classes. So decarbonization has to wade into a class struggle. I'm going to pause there so that you can take this artifact, this story from 1840s Lancashire, England. That is where Andreas Malm cites as the origin of today's fossil capitalism. As we have been doing, to pause, take a moment to be in silent reflection. I'll remind us of the questions. What are you noticing first? What feelings are coming up for you? What feels familiar or surprising or even troubling? I want to remind us as we pivot towards circle conversations around the table about our covenant surrounding this practice. Respect the talking stone, whatever that talking piece is on your table, to speak from the heart. That our listening is for the purpose of understanding, not polemics. Say just enough. I might even say, leave someone hungering with curiosity. And anyone may pass the talking piece at any time. So to take your time, you don't feel rushed by this process, but to listen, to speak, just enough. At each table, there should be copies. There are 3 rounds, and there are questions listed under each round. Each person should just choose one question. Please do not try to respond to all 3 questions or all 2 questions. Just choose one question to speak to. Let's take about half an hour to go through all 3 rounds, and then I will invite us back. If you haven't shifted toward praxis, just a prompt to shift toward praxis question, round 3 questions. Please take another 3 minutes and then I'll call us back. 3 minutes. I'm going to call us back. So if you would wrap up your conversations. One of the conclusions that Andreas Malm obviously makes, you can kind of think your way to this, is that our current system was made on choices. Coal, steam, nuclear, all of these energies, these are not inevitabilities. There were choices that were made, and from Malm's point of view and many other scholars, that were choices that were made even here. What do we do with this intrinsic separation of ownership between labor power owned by the workers? What does that even mean? The means of production. And when we split up and separate these two regimes of ownership, how are they to relate to one another? And for moms, this wanting to discipline labor, wanting to control labor, right, is at the heart of not the technology, but the movement and utilizing technology as a way of having power over labor. But that these were choices that we made, right? There are handouts at the table that provide alternatives. That the tip of the iceberg that seems so visible and so powerful, underneath the water, that the iceberg contains other possible choices, other economies that are at work. On one side, you have Maria Mee's understanding of racial capitalism or patriarchal capitalism, of all of the realities of human relationships and non-human relationships that undergird the visible structure, that are kept invisible and therefore out of sight as possibilities for us. And on the other side, you have diverse economies, as I mentioned, diverse economies that have always been with us. And in some sense, as they go under the surface and they go underground, we know about economies that regulated those who were living fugitivity, those who are doing reconstruction on an island after slavery, right? Those are all speculative fiction, those of you who were here this past Sunday, right? So the handout is there for us to wonder. I want to invite just a couple tables. What struck you about kind of praxis, and what are the next steps, particular to fossil capitalism? What are alternative ways that we can move beyond not just individual efforts, but that make structural and systemic change that are about all of us collectively? Any ideas that stood out at table conversations?
So the class struggle that is mentioned here, declassification.
Can you hold them close?
If we cease classifying everybody millions of times, saying, oh, you belong to this class and this gender and this job, and learn to see one another as divine human beings, as real community. That's really what we can do to overcome all of the propaganda of the class struggle classification.
I want to build on that. Thank you for that. The way that the class is often one of the identities and the identitarian ways that we engage, right? How do we begin with class as an identity? We often talk about the middle class, although many scholars would say, no, that's a fiction. It really doesn't exist today. Middle class, it only takes one paycheck, not even two, for you to drop into poverty, right? And so how do we shift from an identitarian understanding of class to more of a Marxist understanding of class, which is about class conflict. It's about class struggle. Class is about the friction and the tension. So yes, to the perceptions, all of the stereotypes that go around working class, the bourgeoisie class, right? But how do we begin to analyze and understand the dynamics of conflict, right, that are in the interplay of class? So when you think about class, less about what are the markers in that layered cake. I'm middle class, I'm working class, what are the stereotypes that accompany that? But how do they interact with each other, right? Constantly on a day-to-day basis. When we watch the headlines, what's the interaction that's going on, that's struggling in between, right? There was another.
So a theme that came up at our table over and over again was we have the technologies that we need, but the important thing is to come together as communities, starting in small communities and building communities together into larger communities to change the bigger structure. And I think that's also a way of classes coming together, because if we have a common goal, if the goal is to change how we do energy and who's in charge of it and who has the power over it, and we start out as this room together, but then this room together pairs with another group of people who may be less homogenous in terms of class, but we have the same goal, then classes start to come together as well.
The question of how do we democratize energy? How do we democratize that site of production? Yeah.
Building on the community aspect, some of the things we discussed here were tool lending libraries for communities, bartering systems. I would love to see something at this church where we have a lot of people with a lot of skills and we have a lot of people with a lot of needs, and we get them together in the skills and we trade skills with each other, kind of going off the grid, shopping at cooperatives, the buying nothing groups where you're not paying any money, you're just giving away the things that you don't need to somebody else who needs it, and at some time you may take something yourself. So those sorts of things, we're going off the capitalistic grid and becoming more of a community grid.
Thank you. Other insights that stood out at tables that have not yet been mentioned? I want to take the next 2 minutes or so to shift, especially for those of you who have been seeing the dots connect through the 6-part series, about how racial capitalism, in the way that we sort and stack and classify people, right, has always been intrinsic to capitalism. The way that it plays out in healthcare right now, the way that it plays out in debt, as Oscar led us into reflect together. I would love to invite those who have been sort of connecting the dots. How are you going about that? And is there something emerging as you begin to connect the dots? Remember, there's no A answer, only a B+1. This is a work in progress. And again, this is absolutely a continuation of our anti-racist work. But I'd love to hear from some of you who are connecting these dots.
When I see how much power's been taken over the years and funneled to the top, and then combined with where we're at with climate change, I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to end up figuring all this out in real time, and it's coming pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Oscar has been a wonderful thought partner for me in terms of approaches that are incremental and approaches that are fueled by the sense of urgency, and both have their place. Andreas Malm, some of you may know, he went out to write another book about how to blow up pipelines because he's interested in violence that we can do as activists to infrastructure, not violence to people and living beings, because he's weighing what are the ethics in terms of a certain timeline, a real timeline of violence that is being wrought upon the planet, human and non-human organisms, and future generations, against the violence that we do to blow up a pipeline, right? And so he and Bill McKibben famously are going back and forth around similar questions about what does this moment require us in our strategy and our tactics as well. If you do blow up a pipeline, don't tell me. Anyone else, as you begin to connect the dots, are there questions even that are surfacing? Oscar has something. Oh, yeah.
I've also been reading and thinking a lot about Timothy Snyder's work and his demand that for everything that you know you want to blow up or break, you also have to imagine what are you searching for the presence of. You have to name it, you have to be able to envision it, you have to share it with other people, you have to build it together so that you know what is the thing you are longing for the presence of, not just what are we trying to get rid of. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of this community in my life and helping me think about that.
But in terms of other authors, you mentioned Timothy Snyder. After Andreas Malm, if you want another really seminal thinker, Timothy Mitchell comes out with Carbon Democracy, but he's building on the work that Malm has done. What does carbon democracy and how does politics and fossil fuel capitalism interact today beyond steam coal, which is the area that Malm was working on, to oil? So if you want to understand what's going on behind the curtain with oil right now, not only in Iran, but in the world and the infrastructures of the oil economy, Timothy Mitchell is a seminal, powerful. He is weaving into complexity like very few other people are. We are approaching the end, and I know Oscar has some practical sort of next steps and participation opportunities. So Oscar, do you want to mention some of those things, and then I will close us?
Sure. This actually goes back to what you were saying, which is how do we start to connect the dots between all of these things? And some of you might remember 6 weeks ago when we started this series, we talked about how it was linked with the People's Agenda that Isaiah put out, and how the People's Agenda had been somewhat taken over in January and February by responding to stuff, winter weather that goes by no other name. But part of that agenda informed all of the topics of this series, from healthcare to housing to sustainable communities to childcare, which we didn't really touch on in this, but we could have. That agenda is moving towards some big actions. So one of those actions is happening this Sunday, not Saturday, Sunday. On Palm Sunday, our Christian siblings throughout the Twin Cities are descending on the state capitol to proclaim that you can be a faithful person without being a Christian nationalist. That's become sort of the primary action to come out of the People's Agenda this spring. Now, as you probably know, we are not a Christian denomination, Unitarian Universalists, so I'm going to talk about what we're doing in a moment. I'll be at the state capitol on Sunday. I would love it if you join me, but that's not actually where we're primarily aiming for. The thing that Isaiah has asked non-Christian participants and Unitarian Universalists specifically to step into, like the organizer last night asked me, Oscar, how many of your Unitarian Universalists can you get to this? And I said, I'll ask him tomorrow. Is an action on April 15th around tax day. And from here, you can see that the jump from racial capitalism to how we talk about taxes is about that wide. So here's one of the things that's come up in Minnesota. Over the last 6 months, we've dealt with Metro Surge. We've also dealt with the cuts to SNAP benefits. We've also dealt with a lot of cuts to Medicare and Medicaid in the state of Minnesota. One of the effects of that is that Hennepin County Medical, HCMC, is drowning, like in danger of shutting down. HCMC is many things. It's a research institution. It does high level care. It's got one of the best burn units in the country. HCMC is also the hospital of last resort for Ramsey and Hennepin County. It's where you go if you have nowhere else to go, and it might close. So the ask is on April 15th to come to the Capitol. There'll be a big public event, and then there will be lobby visits with as many state representatives as we can get to meet with us to say the federal government is not saving HCMC. So what are we going to do here in the state of Minnesota to make sure that that hospital stays open? What are you, our elected representatives, going to do to make sure this hospital stays open? Here's where it gets complicated and where it touches on tonight, even if that means raising taxes. Because the whole system, when we talk about taxes, is predicated on how do we save the most money. What would it look like if we imagined a world that started with how will we take care of our neighbors as the fundamental question? Not how do we save money? How do we take care of each other? Because that's a lesson that we've learned in Minnesota the last couple of months. So how will we now apply it? So you'll hear a lot more from me between now and April 15th, because I'm going to have the Isaiah organizer keep asking me, how many of your Unitarians are you going to turn out? She doesn't just mean unity, she means all of the Unitarians in the state of Minnesota. So I'm going to talk to my colleagues tomorrow to ask them how many are they turning out. But you're hearing it here. So take out your phones, circle April 15th. Your taxes are also due that day. It's an easy date to remember. We're going to start around 10. It's a whole day thing. So there'll be a clergy press conference, I think at 9:45. There's lobby training from 1 to 3. We're planning lobby visits from 3 to 4:30, and then there'll be vigils in the evening. All of this will be written down and in the material you get emailed to you from Unity in the next week or so. But it is pretty much an all-day event. You can come to part of it, you can come to all of it. I will be there for all of it with bells on. But as we start to talk about, like, how do we turn theory into practice, I think this is a pretty concrete way. April 15th. How will we imagine being neighbors, and how will that change the system?
To ask the question about neighbors is to step into a whole vision, a more complete perception of reality. What happens between labor power of the worker and the means of production is a separation. And I want to end, as I think about all of the connecting of the dots, one of the first Greek words that I learned in seminary is the word for sin that's most often used, which is hamartia. Hamartia often is translated as missing the mark, separation, gap. I wonder what difference it makes to the woodpecker, that separation between the woodpecker and their bill. I wonder what difference it makes to one neighbor during Metro Surge and another neighbor in their neighborhood. I wonder what difference hamartia, a gap, a separation, makes when one of these dots is competing with another dot. Who benefits from such separation, such competition? In the deep places of the iceberg have always been alternative ways of being oikumena, of being community, of how we exchange and how we interrelate. And these alternatives from a religious spiritual point of view have always pivoted on the question of how am I going to choose to be in relationship in a way that honors the ever-expanding whole. May that holy practice continue to grow in clarity and deepen in confidence and commitment as we press on. Thank you for your commitment to this practice and the series. And have a good night.